Hello and welcome to the Lebanese Politics Podcast. My name is Benjamin Red. I'm joined as always by Nizar Hassan. Nizar, we had a crazy day yesterday.
Hey Ben, yes indeed, it was really crazy. It was actually the first big protest, relatively. Many thousands of people were in Martyrs Square. The first big protest, meaning after the coronavirus pandemic, etc. And it was also a very problematic one for reasons we will discuss in later in the episode. But it started as a protest, mostly peaceful, some scuffles with security forces as usual. Then a bunch of people from supporters of Amal and Hezbollah showed up from the Bashar al-Khoury side of the Martyrs Square. Some tensions between them and the security forces, and between them and the protesters, and between protesters and security forces as well. Like, it's always the same thing, right? When you have two bunch of people and lines of security forces or army between them, there are always tensions, but nothing really major, except that the protesters from the Amal and Hezbollah sides said something that was very provocative, which is they insulted Aisha, one of the wives of Prophet Muhammad, who they obviously shouldn't insult, even if they are from a different sectarian background. It's not like something that is extremely divisive, but there is history of like divisions and the use of Aisha's name in sectarian tensions. In Lebanon, I've seen it before for sure, on May 7, 2008, and during those incidents of high sectarian tensions between Shiites and Muslims. But anyway, this turned into a major deal with like everyone condemning it, and like highest rank of political forces and religious institutions going up with coming out to statements saying how this is like rejected and we should not do it, etc. And trying to say, oh, there's a huge sectarian tension happening that we need to calm down, because after the protest, like later at night, things turned much nastier than during the morning or during the day, with like shootings happening. I think it was quite random. Like, it was not directed, at people, but it was a lot of gunfire from Tariq Jdidi, from nearby areas, Barbour, etc., areas close here to Msaitbe. And there were also tensions during the afternoon in Ain Rimmani, which is one of the green lines of the civil war, Ain Rimmani Shiyah, because one of them has mostly Christian people and the other one has mostly Muslim, specifically Shiite. And there were tensions between supporters of Hezbollah and Amal, and between supporters of Lebanese forces and generally like young men from the area. So the whole scene yesterday was a scene of like a very alerting scene of like sectarian tensions, etc. Although it started with a relatively mundane kind of protest that wasn't that exciting to begin with. But anyway, we'll talk more about that, I think, in later in the episode.
Yeah, and we're recording this on Sunday. All of this happened just Saturday, yesterday to us, and we're not sure whether more tensions will continue today or if anything will actually happen by the time you listen to this. But yeah, that's the big story for this week. And like you say, Nizar, we're going to be talking more about sort of the implications of this and the reasons behind it a little bit more later on in the show. Very quickly, though, we want to update everyone on the news of the week. Coronavirus, of course, is still a huge concern here in Lebanon. There were 100 new cases reported this past week. That brings the total from 1,220 to 1,320. So exactly 100 cases from Saturday to Saturday. This increase of 100, it's about the same increase as the week before, so going steady. But we did have sort of like there was sort of a large aberration, I guess you could say, in that one day 50 cases were recorded, and also we have this aberration of 42 of the cases from this week are all from Barja, a town in Shuf, and they have all reportedly been traced to a single expat who returned home and was not, I guess, didn't take the needed precautions to keep the virus from spreading. Also this week, we had 2 to 3 more deaths, depending on how you count it. So it brings the total up to 29 deaths so far from COVID-19 in Lebanon. Cabinet has extended the general mobilization for 4 more weeks. They've been doing it sort of in twos, and they went up to 4 weeks for this one, scheduled to end now on July 5th. Also, the fourth phase of expat returns was announced. So that's going to run from June 11th through the 19th. That's this week into next. And this is going to be sort of a scaled down one. You'll remember that phase 3 is really, really large. I think something like 11,000 Lebanese were supposed to be returned, something like 50 or 50 plus flights scheduled. Phase 4 is a lot smaller than that. It only has about 18 flights scheduled right now. Also this week, in sort of governmental news this week, both the president and the prime minister signed a decree calling parliament into an extraordinary session from June 8th until October 19th. This is really important because we've talked about this before, but just to remind everyone who doesn't keep track of parliamentary schedules, the Lebanese parliament meets twice a year in 2 regular sessions. The first regular session, the spring session, ended at the end of May, and so right now Parliament couldn't meet if it wanted to, right? And so what they've done is they've used this constitutional mechanism to basically allow Parliament to meet if it so chooses to do so between now and the fall session that begins on October 20th. So this literally runs right up to when the fall session begins. And this is really important because a lot of the things that need to happen right now for basically, fixing the fiscal ship of state, so to speak, and fixing the economy and all this stuff, it requires parliamentary action. And part of this as well is if there's some agreement reached with the IMF, that's going to require some sort of parliamentary action, and Parliament has to be able to meet in order to do that. Of course, Parliament has been unable to do the most basic of things, which is pass a capital controls law, which most observers see as crucial, and that includes reportedly the IMF itself.
Yeah, this I think will be the most pressing task, right? Because the negotiations are ongoing, and most of the IMF conditions will have to be translated into laws. So it's quite a big task for the upcoming period for Lebanon to kind of satisfy the prior actions conditions of the IMF.
Right, and speaking of the IMF talks, BDL and the Ministry of Finance this week finally sort of agreed to get on the same page numbers wise. This is really remarkable. We've known that the positions of BDL and the Ministry of Finance have not been the same in negotiations with the IMF, which, I mean, obviously you need to have a united negotiating position, right? If you're the state of Lebanon, you need to have a united negotiating position. And they don't seem to have that. Not only that, but they don't really even seem to have all the same numbers. And so finally they've taken a step, to agree, okay, we're very least going to get on the same page numbers wise. That's what they say. Of course, we'll see what happens. I'd like to note this next item just really quickly. There has been an apparent murder of a high-ranking banker here in Lebanon. Antoine Daher was the head of group ethics and fraud risk management at Byblos Bank, one of the largest banks in the country. He was found dead, I believe, in his parking garage. He had been hit in the head with a sharp object. And I just want to say there's a lot of speculation out there right now, but we really don't have any further details on this that have been confirmed.
This might be a big case if it's not a personal one. So this is a case to keep an eye on.
Absolutely, absolutely. In other financial news, an update on the Lira. The exchange houses are open again. They were closed for about a month, and now they are open again. And the rate as of right now is about 3,900 Lira to the dollar. The idea with this is to bring the rate down to 3,200. And this will apparently be done by force, as in the state moving in to shut down black market operators, as well as exchange houses that fail to follow the set rate. Also, this does not seem to be, so this doesn't seem to be done by BDL or anything like some sort of BDL monetary intervention. In fact, one of the representatives of the syndicate of exchange shop owners said that, BDL doesn't really have the funds to do that anymore, to support the peg in that way. And the drop in the Lira has had far-reaching consequences, as everyone who's listened to us knows, for all of Lebanon, for everybody in the country. Of course, though, those problems are magnified when you talk about migrant workers and domestic workers here in the country. They are getting probably the shortest end of the stick in all of this. And so this week we saw, just incredible scenes of a lot of Ethiopian workers basically being driven to the consulate and dropped off by the people who had employed them. And this is become just sort of like this wild story where basically domestic workers and migrant workers are not getting paid what they were supposed to get paid. They're not getting paid in dollars like they were largely. And so they've seen a real drop off in the money that they can take back. And now it seems as though they're not being, some of them are not being paid at all, to the point where their employers are saying, we don't want to have you around the house anymore. We don't want to have you. And so we're just literally going to drop you off at your country's consulate.
Yeah, it was really surreal, but like, unfortunately, not so surprising, because like when you have a system like kafala that commodifies people so much, really, like, you don't see people treating domestic workers as humans in a lot of cases, because the system really deals with them as commodities, more or less. And apart from this big story and real story, we've also had some bad things happening on the internet, with like people going on second-hand item groups on Facebook and other sites and like advertising their domestic workers there. There's this like the whole panic about what to do about your domestic worker, and I understand that people find a huge difficulty in getting dollars. It's almost impossible now to pay original salaries, right? Like if you were paying $200 to your domestic worker, now you have to pay 800,000 for to get the dollars. So I understand it's a real difficulty. I believe that the state has to intervene with creative solutions on how to resolve that. But the behavior of families now and of employers has been really outrageous. It's really insane. As you said, like this incident was like the clearest manifestation of the injustice against them. The labor minister intervened, but also like the biggest role is usually played by NGOs and activists who point at these things when they happen and give them enough attention that they need, and then like refer some of the workers to shelters, etc.
And this week we also saw a protest by civil defense workers. These are the emergency workers, a lot of EMTs, that kind of thing. And they're volunteers, but they've been promised positions with pay. That hasn't happened. And so they protested this week in front of the Interior Ministry.
Yeah, they've been protesting for many years for the exact same demand, and now there's higher concern that they might never be employed because of the austerity push by the government and the expected rules of no public employment that will be imposed as part of the IMF deal if it happens. And finally, we also had like one of bizarre and quite outrageous thing that happened this week as well, with Jamil Sayed, the current MP from Maalbek al-Hermel, and previously the head of general security during the days of the Syrian occupation of Lebanon prior to 2005. Jamil Sayed, if you don't know him, is someone who's been known to be very close to the Syrian regime. After Rafiq Hariri's assassination, he was put in jail, but then a few years later he was released for lack of evidence against him, along with the other generals. If you remember the case of the 4 generals, he was one of them. And Jamil Sayed has been always been accused of having a main role in like enforcing Syrian regime hegemony in Lebanon and persecuting people who were expressing anti-Syrian regime sentiments during the years of 1998, 1997, 1998 till 2005 when he was jailed. So this is the background for this man. He ran in the elections. He got one of the highest number of votes in the country, insane number of votes he got in his district. And he's being kind of groomed. It's being said to be replacing Birri. Okay, so this is a high profile politician. And
as Speaker of Parliament, not as head of Amal.
Not as head of Amal, of course. And he's quite independent from Amal and Hezbollah at the same time, heavily dependent on his good relations with Hezbollah. And in the end, he was on Hezbollah's list in the elections. But the important thing is that he's a high-ranked politician now, and he's using a lot of populist discourse to attract people who previously disliked him and now think he is, pro people and their rights, etc. And this week, he kind of screwed all of this at previous attempts of reviving or of improving his reputation by making a statement that was so outrageous, basically saying, if if an official, for example, sees protesters coming near his house and his family is in his house and the protesters are saying bad things about him, like insulting him, and if he doesn't have guards outside of his house, he should shoot them from the window. Like, I have no fucking clue how he thought this is an acceptable thing to say. He was, I think, in parliament or somewhere like really official, making a statement to press. It was not some comments that he made randomly or that were leaked, right? He's made them intentionally, and he was like, I am responsible for my words. If you don't have guards outside, shoot them from the window. Absolutely outrageous. And it comes 1 week after protesters were at his place, accusing him of being part of corruption and saying, harami, harami, Jamil said harami, which means thief. It's basically a slogan that is said against, a chant that is said against anyone accused of corruption, usually in protests. And it was a peaceful protest. Nothing major happened. No one even heard of it, to be honest. It was just a minor thing. But Jamil Sayed reacted very impulsively in the beginning when it happened, accusing the Communist Party of standing behind it, etc. Then he apologized, saying, okay, the Communist Party have nothing to do with this. And then a few days later, out of nowhere, he just makes this outrageous statements about shooting protesters from the window. And obviously, we didn't see any serious political movement against what he said from like the authorities, and I don't expect to see any developments on that. And given that he is an MP and he has immunity in this great system.
Yeah, I mean, he's one of these people who has been throwing out a lot of like bombs about, oh, these other politicians are corrupt, all of this stuff, especially, around the time of the revolution and everything like that. But when it comes down to it, it seems as though he's firmly on the side of the elite here in this struggle.
Yeah, which is where he should be, and which is where he really is. So it's good. I'm quite glad that he made these statements, to be honest.
All right. Well, and speaking of protests, that's our main topic this week. The big protest that happened on Saturday. I mean, and there's a lot that goes into this, right? Because it wasn't a normal protest like the ones that we saw October 17th, right after the revolution started, right?
Yeah, this has been one of the most, the biggest manifestations since COVID-19 started, because there's like this. So I'll tell you kind of how this developed, or how I understand it to have developed. Like there's been a lot of sentiments that say, okay, we can't stay at home anymore. We can't just say we're not going to protest until coronavirus ends, because it's not going to end probably till a few years from now when we get access to enough vaccines, because people with corona will keep, being alive and moving around the globe. So it doesn't make sense to say we're gonna stop protesting till it happens, especially as this is one of the most important or sensitive moments in the country's history. So this is the general mood that has been building up for the last few weeks, and then some people started calling for protests on this day, the June 6th, right, with under different demands. But there have been a lot of suspicious calls for protests specifically against Hezbollah's weapons on this day, although no political groups at all, either from the establishment or from the civil society or the opposition political groups, endorsed this demand formally or called for protests based on this demand. There have been some circulating invitations or called for protests based on that demand. Basically, the translation of it into official or formal terms is the implementation of UN Security Council Resolution 1559, which is basically the one that included that Syrian regimes have to withdraw from Lebanon back in 2004 or 5, and that Hezbollah, as other militias did, should surrender its weapons to the state in Lebanon. So this is one of the most divisive topics, obviously, in Lebanese politics, and it was very weird for people to be calling for protests about this demand specifically now. And this is why I think no political group at all thought it was a good idea to endorse it. But still, it became the biggest news of the week. The other main demand that groups did call for example, Sab'a and other groups mobilized based on the idea of early parliamentary elections, to which there was also a lot of critique because, what can elections fix now if you have an elections in 7 months or 8 months based on the current law, and without any change in social or economic policies, any change in the electoral law or the electoral system, you will not really have a very different outcomes or results from the elections. So there are a lot of critiques for this and other reasons against this demand. But these were the most kind of significant demands that came out in public discourse. And it was a very difficult moment because this protest was basically a test for political groups, right? Do you participate or do you don't? Do you boycott or basically avoid participating? Because the amount of propaganda that we have been seeing in the last at least week or 10 days from the surroundings of Hezbollah and Amal, and people who claim to be on the left but are basically really left-wing extensions of Hezbollah and Amal's politics in a way or another, especially when it comes to Hezbollah's weapons and its military might, etc. These people have been doing a lot of propaganda saying like everyone who will go down to the streets on June 6th is a traitor and is someone who wants to create sectarian divisions and all of these things. And this propaganda has been insanely successful in creating tensions and creating negative feelings from people in the Shiite communities specifically, and people who have opinions favorable of Hezbollah's resistance, etc., to be taking a very strong stance against the protests. So this meant that political groups that seek to, attract members or potential members from all communities cannot really go to or accept or endorse this protest with a clear mind. So most groups actually did not, when it comes to groups on the left and progressive groups, except for very few, including the political movement that I'm part of, Lihaqi, which decided to go to the streets, but under a very different kind of discourse, and kind of force its own discourse in the street with a huge banner calling for basic socioeconomic rights, and the discourse focused on socioeconomic needs. But generally, this was a really difficult moment.
Especially with this demand, I think on 1559, that's one of these things that's really out of place given the history of the Thawra, given the history of the protests. Not out of place in the normal history of Lebanon, right? Because this basically goes back to recreating the March 14th, March 8th divide. And that's something, that's been institutionalized in Lebanese politics and in the elite since the assassination of Rafiq Hariri in 2005. The thing that strikes me as, this is weird and out of place, and there's something a little bit off about this demand is, that first off, we haven't seen it so much in the protests, but also it just serves, the fact that people are bringing this up right now shows me that not everyone's eye is on the financial ball, so to speak, and the governance ball, so to speak. They're much more concerned with this imbalance of power amongst elites that stems from Hezbollah being the only legally armed party in the country. And that's, to me, it seems like a very, very much a side issue, given the enormity of the collapse that Lebanon is looking at.
Yeah, and Ben, I think most protesters agree with you. I only saw one sign in the protest that mentioned Hezbollah's weapons. No political groups, as I said, mentioned Hezbollah's weapons. As you said, this is not a demand that is usually held up in protests. So why was it there? We tend to explain these things usually in terms of, we call them the acts of intelligence agencies or basically state agencies or party agencies that try to kind of manipulate what is happening in the streets in order to give it a different dimension. And this is why some people on the left especially have been talking about the June 6th protest as a counter-revolution, because it carries this demand that is quite alien from usual Thawra demands and Thawra discourse, and it's clearly aimed at re-entrenching the divisions based on March 8 versus March 18, which is primarily about Hezbollah's weapons and the relation to the Syrian regime. So this is understandable, right? Like, this clearly looks like a counter-revolutionary thing to do, to divide people based on the line that for sure they will not agree on. What to do with Hezbollah's weapons and what kind of relationship to have with the Syrian regime, especially the first thing, because this is a really genuine issue of disagreement among the Lebanese people. It's not really like fabricated or projected. People don't have the same opinions, and they have serious divisions about this. So I agree that like resurfacing this demand specifically is like a very counter-revolutionary thing, and this is why it's not very understandable that it comes from people who are part of the Thawra, and this is why no political groups at all endorse it. But there was a different opinion about the protests, saying no, political groups that have progressive and left-wing discourse should not boycott the protests, should be there, should not leave the streets, and should be pushing for their own discourse. What I said Lihaqi decided to do. And this is an issue. A lot of people criticize Lihaqi for it. Obviously, I understand. I was not very excited about participating or for participation in general in the beginning. But the thing is, what happened, for example, in Lihaqi gives you an idea about this whole dynamic. The people who are in Beirut, activists who are in Beirut, were mostly, and people on the left especially, were mostly against participating, while people in the regions, in Lihaqi's grassroots in different regions, were more excited about it. And they formed the majority of people who were part of the protest. And this is why basically it's always good to not be making political decisions about things like that in Beirut among the circle or inside the bubble of activists, right? You need to see whether people are genuinely interested in participation. And when we saw that people from different areas of Lebanon were sending us news about their participation, then it made sense to participate, because there is a genuine like 5,000-10,000 people who are there and who are protesting for reasons that we know and we trust. Although some people are trying to ride the movement with their own demands, but there is a serious like desire to go to the street and anger to be expressed, etc. So you should be there, and you should not leave the streets just for the discourse of some bourgeois forces and sectarian forces.
You're talking about people who are not necessarily partisans of the Lebanese forces or Kataib or Baha Hariri or any of these other, forces that supposedly were out on Saturday.
Yeah, definitely. And even some people who are supporters of Kataib or of Lebanese forces, I think some people who have very strong stances against Hezbollah know very well that this is not the time to bring this up. So there's a sort of political maturity that exists. It's not like people are focused on one issue and they don't see anything else. But you have to take into consideration that recently we saw the whole issue of Hezbollah being accused of smuggling oil to Syria. So this issue, this scandal, kind of brought up a lot of discussions about, what's the purpose of all the government's economic measures if there's one military establishment called Hezbollah that can do its own kind of illegal commerce and make us lose money, because the oil that we are buying from abroad is subsidized by the state, by the central bank, with dollars, and there's a problem and there's a shortage of dollars, and we saw before how gas stations went on strike because of that. So there were a lot of like the issue of Hezbollah's weapons. This is how it's resurfaced recently. But if you look at the last few weeks, you don't only see that, you see also Qabalan's speech that we talked about, the Shiite Islamic cleric who made like the big statement saying the Ta'if agreement is done and the national pact is no longer valid, etc. Big talk that scares the Christians, and we talked about that before in previous episodes. The federalism debate, which is also a highly sectarian debate in Lebanon about whether we should turn into a federal state, which means every sect will be basically have its own district or its own little state to govern. Hariri's rise as like a more anti-Hezbollah and like a Sunni macho guy to counter Saad al-Hariri's defeat or whatever. All of these things have been building up, right, in a way that prepares the country to be back in the framework of original political divisions of March 8 versus March 14, rather than divisions that were central to the uprising itself. And one of the main achievements of the revolution, in my opinion, is that it kind of rotated the lines of conflict. Instead of making them about, people from different sectarian backgrounds and different political stances on Hezbollah or Syrian regime or whatever, it became a conflict between people on the top and people in the bottom. This is one of the main achievements. And counter-revolution, to me, is the political forces attempt and the sectarian forces and religious institutions attempt to rotate this line of conflict back to the original ones, which will ensure their sustainability. Because if you hear the news last night, you will see basically 30 minutes of the news on any TV channel was basically the main establishment, religious and political organizations and institutions and figures making statements against sectarianism. These are literally the people who are constantly reproducing and enforcing sectarianism in Lebanon. And the whole news was how they are condemning sectarian tensions in the streets or whatever, things we talked about in the beginning of the episode.
Yeah. It's extraordinarily ironic, right, that these institutions, who are like in many ways designed to protect sectarianism, they're the ones coming out and saying, no, don't be sectarian, when really, well, what are they? They are representatives of sects who defend their sects. They are the most sectarian parts of Lebanese society in a certain way of looking at things.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about Dar al-Fatwa, about Hezbollah, about Amal, about Hariri, Jablat. Like, these are the symbols of sectarianism. And it was basically a whole theater play that, I don't know, it's really one of the most like frustrating and moments that create a sense of desperation and hopelessness in Lebanon is when these things happen, because they all look so fucking fabricated, and it's so clear how political and religious forces kind of exploit the marginalized young men who are sent to the streets as in form of thugs or qabadiyat to beat the shit out of people. It's just so frustrating because you, as like someone who cares about the country, really can't do anything when you see this shit. But to going back to the politics of it, like I really want to emphasize that when we talk about Hezbollah and Amal supporters going to the streets and attacking protesters, it's usually not that spontaneous, and we should always remember that Hezbollah has and Amal have like basically a point that they always have to reproduce and to establish, which is that in Shiite communities in Lebanon, the issue of politics and who has the widest political influence should not be a question at all, right? And this is something that is a trap that sometimes people fall in when they're talking, when they're analyzing or even mobilizing politically, because they believe that in Shiite areas there is no hope for political change. The conclusion is either we only like do politics or mobilize in other areas, or that there is no hope in change in Lebanon completely. And this is not true. And the uprising and the very serious street action and revolutionary scenes that we saw in many Shiite areas in Lebanon during the uprising, especially in the south and the east, were a proof that no, people there are not like basically special kind of humans who are obedient politically to Hezbollah and Amal at all. This is a very stupid, naive, and kind of quite elitist way of understanding social domination. But still, this is a thing that is a talking point that is always there in the background, and Hezbollah has interest and Amal have interest in maintaining it there, because they want to keep all independent politics, especially that one that is based on real class interests and material interests of people, away from Shiite communities, because this is the only thing that probably can take away some of their influence, a movement that is focused on socioeconomic rights.
And that is a very good point. But then there's also the bottom line, right? We have to talk about money here, and we have to talk about the purpose of the government. That's another big reason here.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, Hassan Diab's government has not been able to achieve a lot and will probably not be able to achieve anything so major except getting money from abroad, right? This is like saving the Lebanese economy or bringing in oxygen to the Lebanese system. And we know from history in Lebanon and across the world that when it happens, that when you have, an IMF deal coming or one that is being made, you also seem to have a lot of suppression of labor unions, of protest movements, etc. It's basically a very simple equation in my mind, from my perspective. If you need to pass an unpopular decision of the size of an IMF deal and further austerity measures and probably more regressive taxation, you need to ensure that there is no serious political uprising facing you and challenging this decision or this direction. So there is real interest by the government in having this counter-revolution today, even if the conflict turns sectarian, because there's no decision for a civil war at all, and we're very far from it. Even if people are divided more than they are today, it's not a bad thing, because it will only make sure that the independent anti-establishment uprising is weaker than it was 7 or 8 months ago, because they know for sure Hassan Diab, and everyone knows. I'm not saying Hassan Diab is behind this, but I'm saying that the government has real interest, and the political forces forming the government have real interest in this counter-revolution today, and in foiling the popular uprising or another popular uprising from happening, because they all have interest to pump back the oxygen into Lebanese system from IMF money, from Sadr money, from other international aid that might come. So this is their main strategic interest now, and you cannot do that without ensuring some form of stability or support for the government. And we saw this during the early 90s. We talked about it in the Rafi Hariri episode, how there was a need at that moment, similarly to today, to impose a certain security situation, or to basically prevent labor unions from challenging the government's economic plan, which back then was Horizon 2000 and all the neoliberal reforms that it entailed. And today is the Hassan Diab's plan and all the neoliberal reforms it entailed, including specifically the IMF program. So Back then, the army went down and shot at labor union protesters. And yesterday, the army and political and security forces were basically had one command room. They had a joint operation, more or less, and they kicked everyone out of Martyrs Square a couple of hours after the scuffle started. It was a very clear strategy that they've employed tens of times so far since the beginning of the uprising, like pushing people out from Martyrs Square, even like pushing them all the way to almost to Thawra. So it was very clear, like political decision has been made between the Interior Ministry and the Ministry of Defense to end the protests when they have the excuse to do so.
Yeah, and if you're looking at this from the perspective of the IMF, for instance, you want Lebanon to be able to repay whatever money you loan them, right? And Lebanon, it's not Egypt. There's no Sisi at the top that is able to by himself basically direct a lot of the stuff that goes on in the country and suppress protests and whatnot. No, you're in Lebanon, which means you don't have that central power. And so if you're the government, you probably want to demonstrate that you are actually capable of doing things that normal governments can do, and of taking decisions and of implementing things. And one of those things includes, not letting protests get out of hand on the streets.
Yeah, absolutely.
And fundamentally, that is a huge question and something that has always seemed to me to be sort of unlikely, but that it provides a motivation here that the government needs to show that it's competent, that it's able to do its job. Because if, the IMF is most likely going to be asking for, some very politically unpopular things to happen. And if the government can't even keep a handle on protests right now, how is it going to fare when it starts implementing, something in accordance with the agreement with the IMF? Well, maybe those things won't get implemented if the protests get too out of control, right? And so you can definitely see that this is an important facet of this, counter-revolution that you're talking about. That no, we need to show that this system, this elite is resilient. We're able, yes, we're taking a big hit now, but we are able to get our act together, and we will be able to perform up to whatever standards we agree with the IMF and with other creditors.
Yeah, and we'll see how this, we have an eye on the talks between the Lebanese government and the IMF. We'll see how that develops and what happens in the streets in the next few weeks and few months, because these things are very related, as we've been saying, and they sometimes influence each other. Anyway, I think that's all of the time we have for this episode. We will be back soon, not sure if next week or the week after. Until then, I'm Nizar Hassan.
I'm Benjamin Red.
And this has been the Lebanese Politics Podcast. Lebanese Politics Podcast is brought to you by myself, Nizar Hassan, Benjamin Red, produced behind the scenes by Susan Wilson, and the music is by Omar El Fil.